Prior to the global outbreak at the forefront of everyone's attention, a simmering, never-ending story was ever present. America v. China. Two global superpowers, one with a legacy, another rising through the ranks, seemingly destined to face off against one another. The idea is still present, but less pressing, as it seems folks have other things to worry about. But the spread of the virus will eventually slow, and the world will start to move forward again. Then, the race is back on. And if things go a little sideways, conflict may brew. Hello fellow friends and philosophers, and welcome back to the most mind-bending channel on YouTube, Life's Biggest Questions. I'm your voice in the void, Keegan Hughes, and today we're going to be discussing the possibility of a global conflict. What if America and China went to war in 2020? Of course, I'm no global policy expert, nor do I claim to have any insight into the military prowess of modern superpowers. So, to preface this video, I am basing my script on articles and posts from the National Interest and The Atlantic. Links will be in the description for further reading. Before we get started, make sure to give this video a big thumbs up and subscribe for more geopolitical predictions. Perfect, let's begin. The first thing I want to address is the number in this video's title, 2020. It's been a wild year so far, hasn't it? Somehow we're already a third of the way through it. April will be coming to a close very soon, and with that, 4 months will have passed us by. Things we thought we'd be worried about have been placed in the back burner, and it seems that the global focus has shifted specifically to dealing with the pandemic. I'm saying this to make it clear that there isn't very much time to run up to a war between America and China if we're gonna make it happen in 2020. We'd have to fast track a lot of pre-war activity if we want to squeeze it in before the roaring 20s really kick off. Plus, considering how we are still indeed amidst a global crisis, I don't see any world leaders leaping at the opportunity to attack one another. Not yet, anyways. I would assume that COVID-19 would have to be neatly dealt with before anyone thought to launch an attack. Military operations tend to involve being in close quarters with a bunch of other people for extended periods of time. Introduce somebody with the virus, likely unwittingly, and you've got a big personnel problem. Low morale, unwillingness of soldiers to be there, and the generally physically detrimental aspects of contracting coronavirus. It wouldn't be a good time for anyone to fight. Plus, the wartime supply chain would be all messed up. Who gets what supplies? Are we funding hospitals? Civilian relief? The military itself? Where do the medical supplies go? What supplies and assets get made if everyone's sick or at home? It's a tricky line to walk. Seeing how many folks are out and about protesting right now to go back to work, though, you can assume that there would be some baseline of willing workers. But to get a whole country to rally behind a war in a time like this, that's one lofty task. Now that I've got that out of the way, let's consider why a war would happen at all. Prior to the pandemic, it seemed that the likeliest impetus would have had to do with either Taiwan or Korea. If China had decided it was time to impose rule on Taiwan, it's possible the US would then step in. Another possibility would be North Korea attacking South Korea and their allies coming to their aid. One other conflict could be between China and India along the Tibetan border. Any of these three could draw the US into international conflict. The underlying factors here are in all likelihood the growth of Chinese power making the US nervous, Chinese dissatisfaction with the US and its global role, and the US alliance commitments to a bunch of regional states. Now, none of these are enough to cause a war on their own, but a combination mixed in with other conflicts could be the spark that lights the fuse. It's hard to say exactly how it would unfold, but these are some topics to think on. If a war were to break out, it wouldn't look like the wars of the past. No, these two nations are quite far away from each other, and as such would rely a lot on remotely controlled troops. And if we think about how things would unfold, it's almost impossible that a war be fought on US soil. They're geographically isolated from a lot of the conflicts that would propel the war, and a lot of US troops are stationed at bases across 6 continents. Keeping these remote bases locked and loaded requires plenty of globalized logistical planning. Additionally, because the bases are built in allied countries, keeping those alliances up and running is of the utmost importance. US operations in Asia are reliant on alliances with South Korea, Japan, Singapore, the Philippines, and India. These nations also rely on the US for security needs, so there's a bit of a delicate balance going on. For all of these reasons, the likelihood of America entering China is low. The cost of moving troops is high, and the political cost of escalation is potentially higher. There are many risks associated with the US attacking first, and if any of the Asian nations involved decided they didn't want to be involved with the conflict, things could get tricky. If we consider China's potential movement, we can look at its national neighbors. India, Russia, and Japan are all relatively close. However, China relies on a smaller pool of military alliances. There's Pakistan, North Korea, and some smaller nations in Southeast Asia. Trying to guess who would get involved and for what reason is like trying to guess the weather 6 months in advance. Sure, you can use some pre-existing data to do your best, but it's probably not going to be spot on. Now, when it comes to the combat itself, there are some facts that need to be addressed. Of course, we have to look at the size and technical capabilities of each army. China currently has the largest military on the planet, 2 million active personnel in the People's Liberation Army. However, as impressive as the number of soldiers is, you have to look at what they're spending, which in late 2019 was about 1/3 as much as the US. The PLA is largely huge ground-based armies with a fair share of Air Force fighters as well. Their systems are mixed, with some dating back to the Cold War era and others being on the cutting edge. Tanks, planes, it's a bit of a roll of the dice if you're gonna get something brand new or decades old. However, lately they have been playing keep up with the US and Russia, you know, doing their best to copy the technologies employed there. Plus, it appears that China's intelligence sector is pretty proficient, with hackers working wonders. The US has the most expensive military going and is very tech-oriented. Their aerial combat proficiency is streets ahead, and they love to employ drones and guided missiles. It seems that their idea is, why use ground soldiers when you can attack from afar? They like to develop intelligence and then fire a few direct, precise attacks. Kind of like what we saw earlier this year when we were discussing another potential international conflict. Now, talking about the tangible numbers associated with each army is one thing, but intangibles are always a factor in war. You can play out a million different scenarios in war games and still not come close to how the actual conflict would unfold. But if you want to make a more educated guess, you can factor in things like actual combat experience. In this area, the US has more recent experience. This is true especially when considering joint strikes and the like. The last major armed conflict the PLA was involved in was the minimally successful invasion of Vietnam in 1979. They've also had a rough go of really employing joint strikes. Give it time and they will improve though. I suppose the question on a lot of people's minds when it comes to modern warfare is, when do nukes get involved? And really, truly, absolutely, hopefully never. However, it is always a possibility. The US definitely towers over China in terms of nuclear capability. They have 20 times the warheads and more ways to fire them. Add in the purported right to launch a nuke first, even if only being attacked by conventional weapons, and you've got a dangerous nation. China's nuclear doctrine is a defensive one. They say that they will only nuke if nuked first. Reasonable, but then again, doctrines are just words. Who knows if either nation would resort to the nuclear option? People would claim that they'd only be used to de-escalate conflict, but is that really a responsible way to go about things? Well, now, all of what we've discussed so far may seem to give the US a big advantage, right? Well, I also mentioned that they'd be unlikely to launch the first attack and that any fighting would be taking place closer to China. This could potentially put China at a bit of an advantage. See, a war between these two nations wouldn't be one meant to eradicate each other or to take each other's land. Really, if a war broke out, China would be aiming to hold on to whatever advantage they took early and to prevent the states from having any sort of say in what they're doing. The endgame for either nation would be to destabilize the other and lower their control over global events. So if the US wanted to fight, China would have the advantage on its own soil. China's allies are closer and there's more land to work with. Plus, like I said earlier, if any US ally decides they don't want to fight anymore, it cripples their remote abilities. Other destabilizing measures like sanctions and tariffs would be employed, ensuring that certain enemy assets were frozen. Economic pain is just as important as military pain at this point. A lot of the hypothetical war between US and China comes down to the battles that really can't be tested until they happen. Electronic warfare, the ability to make use of joint operations, and a general effective use of weaponry and assets are all necessary to really change the tide. The loser would take a big hit economically, having to replace lost assets and justify the losses to their country. But really, let's hope for more jolly cooperation in the wake of the real global crisis we're facing right now. And that's my take on the imaginary war of 2020. Again, I'm not an expert, but there are plenty of pundits and professors out there with more nuanced, informed takes. Start with the articles I linked and then check out what other people are saying too. In the meantime, sound off in the comments about what you think would happen. Speaking of comments, let's take a look at some of your more macho ones from What If the Dacosaurus Didn't Go Extinct. Inconspicuous Char says, as a local Florida man, I can confirm that we probably would have deep fried this thing. Hell yeah. Honestly, I've had fried gator and it's pretty good. A Beddit user 101 says, what if diseases never existed? Well, this is a tricky one, as there are so many different things that happen in our world because of disease. They've controlled populations, inspired large social change, mutated into useful organisms, you name it. NZ Native 661 says, if we still had them around, they'd probably be more dangerous than great whites. And if that were so, fishing is over for me. What, you wouldn't take up big game fishing? Maybe wrestle with one from time to time? Blue Spirit asks, what if it rained vinegar? A lot of things would be a lot cleaner, I guess. Some things would have acidic holes in them, and fish and chips places would probably be more common. And LXSTBXYS asks, oh, Lost Boys. Ha! And Lost Boys asks, what if GTA was real? GTA is real if you believe. You just have to totally lose it. And Red Ratch asks, what if you eat yourself? I'd have to be pretty darn delicious in order to eat myself. Although if I were a donut, I wouldn't question it. And that's all the time we have for today. Before I spring forth then fall back, make sure to give this video a big thumbs up and subscribe for more war games. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.